Hello everyone, and welcome to another special episode of North Korean Movie Reviews, where today we are looking at the most infamous North Korean movie of all time, the one, the only, Bulgasari. And yes, that's right, I said Bulgasari with a B as it's properly pronounced, not Pulgasari, which the English translation gets wrong due to North Korea using the antiquated Makun-Reischauer romanization system. Directed by the infamous and late Shin Sang-Ok during his imprisonment in North Korea, along with assistance from the Toho Company, the company responsible for the Godzilla franchise, and released in 1985, this movie unofficially represents the apex of North Korean cinema and is by far the most well-known North Korean movie, due in large part to circumstances surrounding the film's creation rather than the film itself. I'm not going to go into detail about Shin Sang-Ok and his wife's kidnapping, as pretty much all of you already know about that. In fact, knowledge of that is essentially a prerequisite to knowing about this movie. Again, this is one of those movies where the story of how this movie came to be is more interesting than the movie itself. So, I will be focusing solely on the movie itself, as well as addressing a common fan theory about this movie's alleged anti-communist theme, and whether or not that theory holds any weight. It doesn't. Mandatory exposition dump aside, let's jump right into Bulgasari. The film proper begins with an impoverished village in feudal Korea, known at the time as Goryeo. Our protagonist Ami, played by Chung Sung-Hee, gathers water while the grunting labor of hardworking villagers can be heard nearby. Ami, who is the daughter of the village chief Taksay, offers her father and the men of her village some water as they're hard at work producing iron tools for farming. During their brief respite from labor, Ami's father asks the village blacksmith Inde to clear a bush by the village. Inde is reluctant to do so, causing Taksay to angrily do it himself, only to realize that inside the bush is a cache of weapons. Inde immediately begs for forgiveness and explains that he is merely hiding them for a friend. Taksay, however, doesn't buy it, stating that he knows Inde is the leader of the bandits that have been fighting against the tyrannical feudal lord's army. Inde begs for Taksay to let him rejoin the bandits in the mountains out of the interests of protecting their village. Taksay eventually relents and laments that in a better world, Inde would have already married his daughter Ami and eventually taken over the forge. The following day, Ami confronts her future husband about his impending departure to the mountains. Inde attempts to console his young love by proclaiming that he will return in 1 year and the two will marry. Ami, however, mourns that she cannot live without him, causing Inde to explain that he has no choice, that since the governor started confiscating rice, all the farming tools from the villages are gone, and that everyone will starve to death if they don't overthrow him. Show, don't tell, Inde. As the time comes for Inde and the men of his village to leave for the mountains, the corrupt governor arrives at the village. There, he tells Taksei that as a talented blacksmith, he is hereby ordered to produce weapons for the army to fight the bandits. When Taksei replies that he cannot because there's no iron, the governor replies that the iron problem has already been taken care of, revealing an ox carrying all of the village's iron farming tools and cooking wares. When Taksei cries out that without these tools they will all starve to death, the governor declares that the town will be stripped bare, and chaos ensues as the governor's soldiers pillage the town for all of its iron, savagely beating those who stand in their way. Inde and his men attempt to fight off the soldiers, but ultimately fail, with Inde being captured. Upon hearing this, Taksei gathers the village at his house and reveals the hidden cache of tools and weapons that were hidden by Inde. He gives the villagers what iron he has left at his forge and helps them hide so that the villagers won't starve. However, as a consequence for this, he too is arrested and interrogated in front of the governor. When asked what happened to the iron, he claims no knowledge of what happened, and says that the Bulgasari, a mythical iron-eating monster from Korean fairy tales, must have eaten it. The governor declares that there is no such thing as the Bulgasari, and orders Taksei thrown into prison with no food or water until he talks. Upon Ami learning of this, she tries in vain to bring her father some food, but is chased away by the guards. In an act of desperation, Ami and her younger brother Anna throw balls of rice through the window of a cell, which Taksei quickly bundles together. Just before eating, however, he decides instead to mold the rice into a small figurine. Knowing of his impending fate, Taksei prays to the gods to allow this figurine to save his village before collapsing from hunger and dehydration. This causes the small figurine to glow. His corpse is brought out of prison, where the villagers mourn over the loss of their leader. Ami takes the figurine as she holds her deceased father's hands in sorrow. Later on that night, Ami attempts to console her little brother Anna's poor attempt at crying by stitching his shirt back together. She inadvertently pricks her finger, however, and a considerable amount of blood falls on the small figurine made by her father. In an instant, the small figure jumps to life as baby Bulgasari is born. Ami and Anna look in bewilderment as Bulgasari begins to eat every metallic object around him. The two are quick to welcome the monster as a parting gift from their late father and adopt him as their pet, because that's what anybody would do. The next morning, the two awake to see their front door open as a result of Bulgasari chewing off the lock and escaping. The two begin to search for him when they stumble upon a now much larger Bulgasari eating all of the iron at their forge. The two make note of the monster's dietary practices and name the creature Bulgasari.
불가사리야, 이리 와라. 불가사리야. 옳지.
Suddenly, however, an old woman comes to Ami, telling of Inde's impending execution. The townspeople rush to try and save Inde from his impending doom, to no avail. As his head is placed upon the chopping block, the executioner raises his sword, only for it to be eaten by Bulgasari, who rushes in to save Inde by eating his chains, freeing him. Bulgasari then attacks the executioner, allowing Inde to escape in the confusion. Eventually, the governor and the soldiers encounter Bulgasari in the armory eating their weapons. Their attempts to kill the monster prove futile as he is immune to all metal-based weaponry. Bulgasari eventually breaks out of the armory and is reunited with Ami and Anna, who are surprised to see him now the size of an adult male. Ami later runs to Inde's hideout, which apparently isn't that secret, and tells him of his mother's capture and an imminent attack on their village. After much debate, Inde and his men decide to launch a preemptive assault on the governor's palace. They quickly scale the walls and break into the prison cells. However, to Inde's horror, they are too late to rescue his mother and little brother, who die in his arms. Enraged over the loss of his family, Inde orders his men to attack the governor directly. Inde and his peasant army quickly overwhelm the governor's guards, and the governor himself is slain by Inde. Once word of the slain governor reaches the king's palace, he dispatches the ruthless General Fuan to dispatch the rebels without mercy. Upon learning of his new foe, Inde knows he cannot defeat Fuan's armies in a straight fight, and instead chooses to redeploy his army to Mount Maru, creating a formidable defensive perimeter around the mountain.
그까진 농사꾼 나으리 애들에게 무슨 힘이 있겠다고? 숨쉴 틈을 주지 말고!
General Fuan orders a direct assault on the rebels. However, his attacks are blunted by the rebels' clever use of terrain to mount ambushes from above. The ensuing battle fails, with Fuan's army unable to penetrate the defense and depth of Inde's forces.
한다하는 장수들이 이게 무슨 꼴인고?
Upon learning of this, General Fuan changes tactics and instead elects to surround the mountain with his armies, instead intending to starve the rebels into submission. The encirclement has its effect almost immediately, as within days the rebels have slaughtered the last of their animals and are reduced to eating tree bark for sustenance. Foreshadowing much. A group of General Fuan's soldiers make their way up the mountain, killing several of Inde's rebels and nearly capturing Ami before being scared off by none other than Bulgasari himself, now even larger and more intimidating than before. Ami attempts to convince Inde that Bulgasari is on their side, to which Inde hesitantly agrees. The following morning, Inde's forces led by Bulgasari launch a successful breakout attempt against General Fuan's encirclement, completely routing them as they run in terror at the sight of the invincible iron-eating monster that is Bulgasari. The rebels reward Bulgasari with piles of captured iron weapons for him to feast on, causing him to grow immensely in size as they march towards the king's palace. General Fuan, now realizing that directly fighting Bulgasari is useless, opts to go for a plan to capture Ami instead and use her as leverage to capture Bulgasari, knowing the monster is loyal to her. A small group of Fuan's men disguised as rebels infiltrate a celebratory festival the rebels are having and kidnap Ami as she gathers water by the river. Bulgasari and Inde's army rush to her rescue, however General Fuan orders Bulgasari to surrender himself or he'll kill Ami. The monster obeys Fuan's orders and enters a large wooden cage that was constructed for him. The general's troops are quick to lock the monster inside and quickly set it ablaze. General Fuan and his troops laugh heartily as Bulgasari is set aflame and vows to kill the bandits after they believe the monster to be dead. Just as they set out to finish the bandits off, however, Bulgasari emerges from the smoldering remains of his cage, bright red from the intense heat and alive as ever. General Fuan and his armies quickly retreat to the river in an attempt to flee, but the burning hot Bulgasari jumps into the river after them, causing many of them to drown. Inde and his army rally around Bulgasari, declaring that so long as he is on their side, they will assuredly win. Back at the castle, General Fuan reluctantly approves of a plan to bury Bulgasari in a large pit currently being dug. He launches a delaying action against Inde's armies to buy some time for the hole to be dug. Meanwhile, Bulgasari appears and General Fuan orders his men to fire on the monster with ballistae, which have no effect. Did Gordio have ballistae? Huh. That is until one of the projectiles strikes the monster in the eye, drawing blood. This only seems to enrage Bulgasari further, however, as he advances unimpeded on General Fuan's position, destroying the ballistae emplacements as well as the castle. General Fuan is not finished, however. In their retreat, he successfully lures Bulgasari into a trap where a shaman priestess is conducting an exorcism ritual on Bulgasari in hopes of killing the monster. The priestess and her maidens dance and chant, causing Bulgasari to fall into the ravine that was dug for him. General Fuan orders the monsters buried, and the troops quickly drop stones over the monster, burying him firmly in the ravine. Fuan's troops counterattack the rebels and end up capturing Inde, hanging him for his crimes. Ami, in the midst of her sorrow, vows not to give up and manages to sneak over to where Bulgasari is buried. With Fuan's soldiers in pursuit, she slices her wrist open, causing blood to fall where the monster is buried. The soldiers apprehend her. She begs Bulgasari to wake up, and soon after, bright flashes emerge from the ground as Bulgasari explodes through the rubble, rescuing Ami. General Fuan and his armies retreat to the king's castle, where he reports that the rebels, along with Bulgasari, are launching a final assault on the king himself. General Fuan alleviates the king's concerns by telling him that a blacksmith is busy creating a new weapon that will destroy even Bulgasari. These new weapons General Fuan is talking about? Cannons. The king hurriedly orders a blacksmith to create these weapons before Bulgasari arrives, because that's totally possible. Meanwhile, Ami's army, along with an even larger and more powerful Bulgasari, quickly descend on the king's palace. The king quickly orders the general to fire his new weapons, peppering the rebel lines with cannon fire. Sounds like Gettysburg. Eventually, the general orders his cannons to concentrate on Bulgasari. In tandem, the batteries hammer the monster with wave after wave of cannonballs, upheaving the earth beneath him and ricocheting off of his iron exterior. Despite the massive bombardment, Bulgasari is ineffective and even shoots one of the cannonballs back at the general after catching it in his mouth. Inevitably, Bulgasari and his armies breach the castle walls and begin to destroy the palace, killing both General Fuan and the king himself by stepping on him. The rebels are ecstatic to celebrate their final victory over the corrupt king. However, Ami and others from the village are not so enthusiastic. Right away, they begin to realize that Bulgasari is consuming more and more of their iron. Eventually, Bulgasari's overconsumption becomes too much to bear for the peasants, who are now beginning to starve due to a lack of iron farming tools. Realizing that they are invariably being led to the same problems they'd endured under the corrupt monarchy from before, Ami attempts to reason with the monster, urging him to show some self-control.
어떻게 살라는 거냐? 응? 불가사리야.
그래도 참아야지. 너야 우리를 위해서 얼마나 큰일을 했냐.
Ami laments that Bulgasari, once the savior of their people, has now inadvertently become their enemy. She realizes that you cannot change the monster's instincts and decides that she must stop the monster once and for all. Realizing that it was her blood that gave him life, she theorizes that she also has the power to take it back. Heroically, she hides herself in an iron bell after using it to gain the monster's attention. Bulgasari crushes the bell and eats it whole, killing Ami in the process, which causes Bulgasari to turn to stone and explode, ending the reign of both the monster and this film. Before I talk about the movie itself, I feel as though I'm compelled to address the elephant in the room. That is, the extremely popular fan theory that this film is somehow a subtle critique on socialism that director Shin Sang-Ok snugly wove into the film as a way of protesting his abduction and imprisonment in North Korea. One thing that has always irked me about this theory is that it's completely baseless, as Shin Sang-Ok never commented on the matter at all during his life. Yet, people accept this theory as though it were established fact, and it's not. In a nutshell, the whole theory is that Bulgasari is an allegory of socialism and how it betrays the very working class it once saved from a corrupt monarchy by becoming too overbearing, creating problems that were worse than what existed before. Now, on the surface, that theory seems to make a lot of sense, provided you know literally nothing about the evolution of economics or the North Korean ideology of Juche. So in order to properly judge this theory and explain how the film falls in line with the Juche idea, we have to understand at least the basic tenets of the North Korean ideology. Now I plan to do an entire video on explaining just what Juche is in the future, however in the meantime, here's a quick rundown. Many people often consider North Korea to be a communist country. I hear it all the time on the channel when I talk about, say, interracial marriage being largely forbidden in North Korea. People will hear this and say, but communism welcomed interracial relationships, just look at the Soviet Union. And it's important for people to understand that North Korea was never a part of the Soviet Union. They did not share the same morals or ethics. Furthermore, North Korea, for the overwhelming majority of its existence, never followed the Marxist-Leninist theory of communism that was used in the Soviet Union. Right after the Korean War ended in 1953, Kim Il-sung and his subordinates sought to distance themselves with the uniformity of Soviet communism, and in doing so created North Korea's guiding ideology known as Juche. Now, Juche is notorious for being almost impossible to define. Even the great Dr. Andrei Lankoff of NK News fame infamously said,
I can basically say Juche is nothing. Because you can basically summarize, say, Marxism. You cannot summarize Juche.
Even North Koreans themselves have trouble defining it.
What the Juche idea is?
Are you a specialist in philosophy?
No, I try to understand. 우리 현실이 훌륭한 주제죠. 우리나라에 지금 펼쳐진 현실이 훌륭한 주제라고 생각합니다. 조선석당에 100번 듣는 것보다 한 번 보는 게 낫다고 우리 현실 보게 되면 뭐 여기서 내가 말하는 것보다 100배의 혀를 그릴 수 있습니다.
This is due in part to the fact that the majority of the North Korean leadership at the time lacked a formal education, and the fact that it was almost designed to be vague in order for it to be harder to criticize. However, Juche can best be summarized as a mix between Stalinism, socialist realism, and Japanese fascism, which in of itself is a flavor of ethnic nationalism. And while it retains the traditional Marxist-Leninist views of capitalism being based on immoral consumerism and consumption, it is, in of itself, substantially different from the traditional Marxist-Leninist thought by design. Among these differences are the racist elements, which tell that Koreans are the master race and that through self-reliance and sacrifice, Koreans are the masters of the revolution. So, with this rudimentary understanding of Juche in mind, we have to analyze this film through the lens of historical materialism, with North Korean characteristics, which tend to have a nationalistic, reductionist view of socialism and history, again due in part to the fact that the people who wrote the Juche ideology lacked a formal higher education. You see, it wouldn't make sense for Burgasari to embody socialism as, according to the evolution of economic thought, socialism comes after capitalism. This movie takes place during the Goryeo dynasty, which lasted from 918 to 1392 CE. During this time, Goryeo was a feudalistic society where peasants worked the land for local governors who were loyal to a central king. Burgasari represents the uprising of the peasants who were tired of living under a feudalist society and sought to overthrow it. Now, if we're following the natural evolution of economic thought, feudalism would be followed by capitalism, which, if we're interpreting Burgasari as an allegorical film, then it must be represented by Burgasari. If we're not following natural economic evolution and Burgasari is representative of socialism, then there is this huge gap where capitalism should be, and instead it just goes straight from feudalism to socialism, and this can't be an anti-socialist film if capitalism isn't represented in the film in some way. Burgasari eating all of the iron that the villagers needed, thus outliving his usefulness, is precisely representative to the Juche ideology critique of capitalism, that it is a system based upon consumption culture that inevitably would lead to overconsumption and stagnation. Take a look at this final scene of the film when Ami tries to reason with Burgasari.
자고 이러냐? 농지기까지 다 먹었으면 우리 어떻게 살라는 거냐? 응? 불가사리야.
그래도 참아야지. 너야 우리를 위해서 얼마나 큰일을 했냐.
In the scene, she tells Burgasari that if he would only show some self-control, they could be allies forever. This embodies the idea of capitalism being ultimately unsustainable due in part to the excessive consumption of goods and material resources used to create those goods. In that same scene, she warns that if Burgasari eats all of the iron in Goryeo, they will have to take Burgasari and invade other countries for their iron.
이 나라엔 쇠붙이가 들창인할 테지. 그땐 사람들이 널 앞세우고 남의 나라를 침범하지 않을 수 없을 게다. 그럼 온 세상이 모두 전쟁 마당으로 화를 깨고 세상은 망한다.
Does this sound familiar yet? Burgasari isn't just an allegory for capitalism, but also imperialism. One of the main criticisms of capitalism by socialists being that it and imperialism go hand in hand, invading other countries to steal their material wealth. The dialogue in this scene should be taken as an explicit foreshadowing of the dangers of capitalism when it has reached its critical phase. That is, when it has consumed all of its material resources at home and must acquire more through conquest. With these points in mind, I believe it's fair to say that Burgasari is not an anti-communist film. It's a socialist realist film that embodies the Marxist idea of capitalism being a stepping stone away from feudalism, but in turn would be replaced by socialism and finally communism. Ami's sacrifice of herself for the sake of her people can be defined as the embodiment of one of the main principles of Juche, which is self-sacrifice for the good of the nation. You see it in all kinds of North Korean films, including several that I've already reviewed, like Wolmi Island, Song of Retrospection, and Order Number 27. Burgasari as a film, in the end, is no different. Ami is the caricature protagonist in socialist realist films, being a lowly peasant who rises up against her oppressors, and in accordance with Juche philosophy, sacrifices herself for the ultimate good of her nation. Furthermore, on a practical level, even if Shin Sang-Ok wanted to include a hidden anti-communist message in the film, there is no way that the DPRK would permit something that even had a suspicion of dissent from being published. If there was an honest attempt to put this underlying theme into the film, there's simply no way he could have hidden it from his North Korean handlers, among them being Kim Jong-il himself, who were a constant presence in every film he produced, which also brings me to my next point. Shin Sang-Ok made a total of 7 films while he was imprisoned in North Korea, yet this is the only film of his where this theory persists. It is worth repeating that Shin Sang-Ok himself never stated that Burgasari or any of his other films made in North Korea had an anti-communist theme. Even in his official biography, which was published after his death, makes no mentions of any attempts to include anti-communist messages in any of his films. So, I think it's safe to say that director Shin Sang-Ok never intended for his film to be considered anti-communist propaganda. Now, obviously that doesn't stop people from interpreting it that way. However, when being objective, if you look at Bulgasari and compare it to his other works in North Korea like Salt or The Runaway, it's very clear that it was made in alignment with the ideology of the state of North Korea, and is not subversive anti-communist propaganda. So, in short, the theory is baseless, and it is my hope that this video will get people to stop sharing this theory as though it were established fact. It's a baseless theory that is inherently dependent on a misunderstanding of North Korea's own ideology. So with that in mind, let's move on to analyzing the film itself. This is without a doubt one of the more peculiar North Korean films ever made. However, if you've been led to believe that it's the best North Korean film ever made, then I must respectfully disagree. I think Abroad Bellflower, The Flower Girl, Negori Chobyung, Traffic Controller on Crossroads, Wolmi Island, I think those are all much better films that were also made in North Korea. This film is interesting because it's such a radical departure from what we've come to expect from North Korean films. Usually when we think of North Korean films, we expect melodrama about working hard for the good of the nation, like Two Families in Haeundaeng, defending the fatherland from invaders like Wolmi Island, or urging someone to accept their place in life like Dorajikot. It's not often we see a fantasy film about a giant monster aiding a peasant insurgency and destroying a corrupt monarchy. It's an interesting premise, and I think that it's really awesome that the North Koreans got Toho to help create the monster suit, as well as the miniatures and special effects. This film absolutely does feel like a cheap Godzilla knockoff. So the film absolutely gets the award for the most creative film in North Korean history. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good film. For example, the acting for the most part is pretty terrible, probably the worst acting of any North Korean film I've ever seen so far. General Fuan, Ami's brother Anna, and the king are notable examples of overacting.
장안을 향해 노도와 같이 밀려들고 있사옵니다. 무엇이? 이젠 죽었구나. 얘를 어찌면 좋단 말인고.
By which I mean their thoughts and feelings are far too exaggerated to be believable. Like the scene where Anna is crying after his father died, or the scene where the king laments that he's finished after Bulgasari escapes from the ravine. It's just so overdone that it kills the immersion for me. Ami, to me, is the only worthwhile character I find whose acting is somewhat believable. Speaking of Ami, as the central protagonist, she is depicted as the caricature socialist realist protagonist, strong-willed, nurturing, and from a humble background. Her maternalistic side can best be seen when she vows to take care of her brother despite just losing their father. She also deeply cares for Inde and is visibly distraught by his death. This doesn't stop her from picking up the mantle and carrying on with the invasion of the king's palace like Inde would have wanted, however. And it's in this sense that we do get to see her have a little character arc as she grows from just a simple peasant woman to a leader of the revolution, and finally a martyr of the Korean people as the Juche ideology would expect. Solid character overall, and actress Chang Song-Hee is easily the best performance of this film. She's also really cute. Sue me. Inde is our film's tragic character. He's a static character who never sways in his loyalty to his home village. Throughout the film, he dedicates his time and effort to training and raising an army to defeat the corrupt regime and care for his people. And although he's technically supposed to marry Ami and the two are implied to be lovers in the beginning of the film, we never see this followed up on at any point. Celibacy is an unfortunate but expected film cliche for North Korea. As a result of this lack of interaction or emotional attachment to Ami or any other characters, I don't feel myself caring for the character as much as I do about Ami. When his capture and execution occur, I find myself unfazed by it because we never got to know anything about him. He's a stereotypical socialist hero who lived by the revolution and died by it, and that's it. Much of the same sentiments can be shared with the film's supporting characters. Tak-se, while an interesting neutral character, both supporting the revolution on paper but wanting to protect his family, is killed within the first 20 minutes, so we never get to form a bond with him to care about his demise. Although he is ultimately the catalyst for Bulgasari's introduction, as he essentially became the monster in death. The film's antagonists, General Fuan and the King, are just these bland, one-dimensional cardboard cutouts who only spout evil rhetoric about killing and pillaging. While I understand the scope of this film probably wasn't to win awards for great character development, I always feel let down when you water down villains to the point of them being caricatures. I mean, who in their right mind would want to follow these people? If you want to make a villain interesting, then you need to show more of the duality of the human condition. Show them do plenty of evil stuff, yes, but also show their more benevolent side so that we can see for ourselves why someone might choose to support them and why others might choose to fight them. Moving on from the characters, the soundtrack, I must admit, is a guilty pleasure of mine. As I said before, I adore the 80s synthetic style piece that's used in the film's introduction. In fact, the whole soundtrack is essentially synthwave, and that's not something you'd expect would work with a film set in the 14th century, but it actually blends very well with the style of the film being made here. It's very much a product of its time, and that's what makes it awesome. The film is also loaded with cheap sound effects when swords clash, but again, that just adds to the overall experience. You know you're watching a low-budget film, so it gets a pass. The film also has, for the most part, decent special effects, due in part to their collaboration with Toho, who provided all of the pyrotechnics as well as the suit for Bulgasari. While there are scenes that look very dated, such as the scenes where the giant Bulgasari is superimposed over Inde's army as they march, and of course you can't talk about this movie without mentioning the scene where Bulgasari swallows a cannonball and promptly spits it back out at the soldiers. Prime example of it's so bad it's good. Despite this, there are scenes that look very good. The film is full of moments where it seems as though the king's army will win, such as the scene where the ballista lodges in the monster's eye drawing blood, or when the breakdancing shaman succeeds in exorcising Bulgasari. In particular, the climactic scene where Bulgasari is approaching the king's palace and General Fuan unleashes the barrage of thunderous cannon fire that relentlessly shells the monster. I'll admit this scene is very well done and it always gets my blood flowing. It almost looks like the barrage will succeed in killing the monster, and to this film's credit, it can be a bit of an emotional roller coaster sometimes. You definitely can't say that the film is boring. So in the end, Bulgasari is a fun and interesting film that, while outwardly depicts a departure in narrative from traditional North Korean cinema, in reality, just like Hong Kil-dong, it's just another North Korean take on class struggle through the adaptation of a Korean folktale with Juche characteristics. There is no hidden message within this film, and I encourage people to watch the film for what it is. Not as an anti-communist film, but as a fun, quirky, infamous movie with an even more infamous backstory that could only come from everyone's favorite East Asian socialist ethno-state, North Korea. I would usually end by posing the question as to whether or not you should watch this film, but in the end, I know that you likely already have. So with that in mind, I bid you all farewell. This is Chosun Yonghwa Review, everybody, and have a great day, and I'll see you next time.